Publication ethics, sort of in the workshop pattern where myself and Tom will be talking on different aspects of publication ethics. Because Tom had to go to the other session in the nutrition conference, we have switched our places, so Tom will be discussing the first, this session right now, and then I'll follow. Please, Tom. Thanks.
Thank you. I used to teach 5th grade, and one of the ways I would get students' attention, and pretty soon they would figure out that they were missing something. So it works with revisions as well as 5th graders. I'm going to talk about publication ethics. What are the criteria for authorship? Sam?
Yeah, as per ICJ,
Mm-hmm.
4 criteria. Design the study, data acquisition.
Yes.
Then
We've added the fourth one.
accepted the final version of the manuscript.
Right.
Reviewed and accepted.
Yeah, they actually added one recently, which was agreeing to assist in investigation of the research. Now, there are more than this definition of authorship, but this is the most common in clinical medicine. I've added these two here. They are not formal requirements for authorship, but the assumption is that if you are an author on a paper, you will know what your co-authors did, and you will have confidence in what they did. You have to meet all 4 criteria to be an author. Sometimes there are people who look like authors but who are not. And this is the ghostwriter problem. So a ghostwriter is someone who should be an author but is not listed as an author. A guest author is someone who is listed as an author but who should not be an author. How many of you know someone who has been a gift author? Someone who has been named on a paper as an author but who didn't do any work. Okay? In America, everybody would raise their hand.
It's a very common habit.
It is common worldwide. We all share that in common. So I can tell you that this is the criteria and so forth, but what I recommend you do is decide on who will be an author before you do the research, and the order of authorship before you do the research or before you write the article. Because if you are early in your career, that's the only way you have of protecting your position as an author. Now, the Council of Science Editors, and I think perhaps WAMI, has adopted this, that the author should be listed in order of the amount of work that they did on the paper. It is not always possible to do this for political reasons, but that's the goal. And we talked about guest and unit authorship. This is my favorite example here. The STAR collaboration, 344 authors, all of whom contributed equally to the work. And I think that this is maybe not everything. Anybody know what this is? This is me. This is my ORCID number. How many of you know what an ORCID number is? Oh, just 1, 2. You came to the right conference. Here we have 4 references, and you notice that they all have Lang TA. Only one of these is me. But these are actual articles. I went through PubMed and pulled them out. And because names are often the same, it's very easy to confuse authorship. And especially in cultures like the Middle East, or China, or Korea, where many names are similar or the same. There needs to be a way to separate, to identify each author. This is called the ORCID number. They are free. You go to the ORCID website and set up an account, and they will give you a number. This is why the ORCID number is important. names change, they have differences in name order. You can see that my name will appear like this, and an ORCID number makes sure that all of those go back to me. It's a long-lasting identity. My ORCID number is on my curriculum vitae. If I were writing grants anymore, it would be on the grant that I would submit because it establishes my publication record. And an employer can now go to the ORCID website and see a list of my publications and have confidence that, in fact, I was the one who wrote those. So I suggest that all of you think about getting an ORCID number if you're going to be an author. In terms of confidentiality, moving on from the ORCID number here, journal editors and peer reviewers have some ethical requirements. In theory, you shouldn't tell anybody that you have reviewed a particular paper. You certainly don't tell them if you've accepted it or rejected it. You cannot use the information in that paper for your own gain. You have to wait until it's published. And you cannot use your position as a reviewer to delay the publication of an article until you get your article published. Now remember, reviewers and authors come from the same group because they're in the same field, so there's lots of competition. And the confidentiality requirement of editors and reviewers is important. You need to acknowledge conflict of interest, sometimes called competing interests. It is possible, in fact, most likely, to have a competing interest without bias. What we want is transparency. It's often said that the solution to any problem in science is transparency. We may not like what you did, but as long as you tell us what you did, we're going to be okay, within reason. Conflict of interest is not necessarily just financial. That's the one that's most easily proven. But it can come from personal animosities. Sometimes people from the same department, one is the author, one is the reviewer, that can lead to conflicts of interest and so forth. And oftentimes there are debates based on intellectual passion, so that can affect people's decisions as a reviewer. Sometimes, typically journals will report any conflicts of interest, and that is as it should be, so that you can assess for yourself whether there is bias. What is plagiarism? It must be late in the afternoon. Okay. Plagiarism is taking credit for the work of somebody else. It's intellectual theft. Now, science builds on the work of other people. So it's not using the work that is the problem. It's not giving credit where credit is due. That's what plagiarism is. The most common form is, I just love this term, citation plagiarism. You simply forget to cite who gave you the idea, and you assume that readers will attribute that idea to you. It's very easy to do, and I would encourage you not to do it. Oftentimes, it's outright fraud. When you steal somebody's information, their theories, their ideas, and you publish them as your own. How many of you know what cross-check is? Oh, you came to the right conference. Cross-check is a computer program that detects plagiarism. It detects similarities between the articles submitted to the journal against a database of millions of articles published by the major publishers. So if you copy text into your article, cross-check is likely to identify it, and then you might have to explain to the journal editor why so much of your paper looks like somebody else's paper. Here's an example. This is the paper that was submitted on the left, and you can see that in these two other papers, the text is the same. And depending on the nature of that duplication, you might have to explain why that duplication is there. Sometimes in the methods section, there will be lots of duplication because there's only so many ways to describe a procedure, and that maybe is not such a problem, but if it's in, especially the discussion, there's a problem. Self-plagiarism is basically using your own words in a second article or a second book. It's mostly a copyright issue, not an issue of fraud. If you are writing in a very narrow specialty, there's only so many ways you can write about, let's say, a statistical procedure. So you're going to use a copy and paste. And that's pretty much okay. But if you use a lot of text from an earlier article, you probably should check with the copyright. So you tell the current journal that a lot of your paper comes from the past journal, and you tell the past journal that you've used a lot of that information in a second journal. Duplicate publication is just that. You publish the same or virtually the same article in more than one journal. This is considered unethical because it formally takes up printed journal space that should be made available for another publication. But there are also some other implications of duplicate publication. This is a particular study done not so long ago. A search for articles with the same title, same first author, and same number of references published in different journals found almost 5,000 pairs of duplicate publication. So yes, duplicate publication will give you 2 publications for your research instead of 1, and we all know that publications are counted, not read. But it has consequences with systematic reviews. So in this case, looking at a total of 25 trials, 16 are unique, but 3 articles were published 3 times, so there's 9 references to that in the literature. If you include all the articles, the pooled estimate, the number needed to treat is 4.9. If you put in just the 3 articles that have not been duplicated, the number needed to treat increases to 6.4, and if you just look at the unique articles, your number needed to treat is getting bigger. So duplicate publication does have an effect on the way science is practiced. It's not simply a nice thing to avoid, it's something that should be avoided. This particular company had a little problem. Undisclosed duplicate publication of 409 articles from 67 journals. In fact, some of the journals that they published consisted entirely of articles published elsewhere without an acknowledgement of the original publication. So it does happen sometimes on a big scale. Now, secondary duplicate publication can be legitimate under certain circumstances. If, for example, there's a language barrier. If you publish a really good article in, let's say, Chinese, that's not going to be available to most of the medical community. So it's perfectly legitimate to publish the article again in English, provided that you tell the Chinese journal and you tell the English language journal that the article has been published before. Do you know what salami science is? This is a salami, okay? And suppose you are having lunch and you're making yourself a salami sandwich. This is meat put in a wrapper. And you're making a salami sandwich, and all of a sudden, company comes over, your friends come over, and you decide to feed them. What do? You cut the slices of salami thinner. So if you take one research project and you slice it into several pieces, that's called salami science. It's a form of duplicate publication, and it's considered unethical. We talk a lot about the least publishable unit. So what's the least publishable unit you can get out of one particular research paper? And then you see how many you can get without sacrificing that least publishable unit. With trial registration, which I think Farhad will talk about, all the papers from the same study should have that trial registration number on it so that instances of salami science can be detected. Here's some example from the literature. In one article, or one research project, the authors published first the safety and efficacy of the drug in blacks versus white. Then the safety and efficacy were compared with Hispanics versus white. And then men versus women, and then safety in men versus women. So with all possible combinations, the methods are the same, the introduction is the same, the references are probably the same. They just gave us subgroup analysis. This is salami science, and probably it's not a good thing. Especially if it's done after the fact rather than beforehand. Patient privacy is a very big issue, especially in America. Farhad will also, I think, talk about this. Here are some of the problems with maintaining privacy. Putting a bar over someone's eyes does not really guarantee anonymity. Who is this? Sorry? JFK, yes. Okay, because he's so well known and the bar just doesn't do it. Let's look at this young man. Is this acceptable for journal publication? No, because this boy's parents and friends can recognize him from this photograph. So just putting a bar over the eyes is insufficient. Another problem is genetic records. So the index patient here has given permission to be named in the article, but it's a genetic study, so that distant relative, who is also identifiable by virtue of the genealogy here, has not given permission. What do you do in that case? The answer is I don't know, but that's one of the problems that comes up with trying to maintain anonymity. My wife is a psychotherapist, with developmentally disabled clients. One of her patients has, is it Munchausen's by proxy? A state where a woman is not pregnant, but she thinks that she is, or says that she is. And as this young woman began to get more and more stressed, she began to say that she was carrying more and more infants. And it was a great case report, but she couldn't write it up because it's too easy to identify the patient. The symptom is too specific. This is the most recent way to commit scientific fraud. You see the original image on the left and the manipulated image on the right. In case you think it happens only in the basic sciences, here's another example in the clinical sciences. You can see that what the author did to make, apparently it's a tumor that went away, is they took one side of the image and they reversed it and turned it to the other side to produce that. Now there are software now that will detect image manipulation, pioneered by the Journal of Cell Biology. They have started screening all of their papers with this software. About 25% of images were modified, but only about 1% affected the interpretation of the results. So if you're going to publish an image, either a clinical image or a laboratory image, look at the guidelines for reporting images. You can look at the CLIP principles on the Equator website. CLIP is Clinical and Laboratory Images and Publication, developed by yours truly. That will give you some guidance into how to report these images. This is appropriate image manipulation. You see that the background has simply been removed so that the attention is focused on the token. How many of you have heard of predatory open access journals? Okay, open access journal is the author pay model. It's a perfectly legitimate journal and way to publish. There are some very fine open access journals, PLOS Medicine being foremost among them. But because it's the internet, it's possible to set up a fake journal and to request that authors publish their paper with you, and you promise fast turnaround times, and you have an editorial board that's made up of people who don't exist, or people who are very famous who don't know that they've been listed as an editorial board. And you tell someone they're going to publish their paper, but the fee for publishing is $5,000, and you want to get published because you want to get promoted, so you send them the money, and they might post it, but they don't edit it, they don't peer review it. It's called a predatory journal. It's a real problem. There are some things you can do. These are what they promise. Quick acceptance. They typically don't tell you how much it's going to cost until after they've accepted your article, because of course you think you're dealing with a real journal. And they will aggressively seek authors. How many of you in your email have received requests to publish in a particular journal? Okay. I don't know how many of those are predatory journals, but I do know that I don't publish in the field of mechanical engineering. So if I get an invitation to publish in a mechanical engineering journal, I'm pretty suspicious that that's maybe not what's going on. Some of the things that they do, they'll use websites that imitate real websites. They'll list editorial board members who, as I say, don't exist or who are very famous and don't know about it. They will use false ISSN numbers. Sometimes they'll use a false impact factor. You need to be very careful with looking at these. Jeffrey Beal is a librarian in Colorado who publishes Beal's List, which is a blacklist of questionable OA journals. How many of you know of Beal's List? Okay, a couple of you? Okay. When in doubt, check this list. Now, this is one guy and a small group of people who are doing their best to identify questionable journals. Some of these journals are actually legitimate journals, and their editors are members of WAMI, because the criteria that they use is very general. So just the fact that it's on the list doesn't necessarily mean it's a predatory journal, but you really have to look closely if it is on the list. You can also look at the directory of open access journals, which is considered the white list of legitimate journals. You can go to the ISI index and see if the journal has an impact factor, which is a good indication that it's a legitimate indexed journal. And with that, I will end and open up for questions. Or have I explained everything so well that there are any questions? Yes?
Sometimes when we conduct a survey type of study, we give the participants several questionnaires at the same time. Okay, then we can produce like multiple studies. So is this ethical or not?
Yes. The comment was sometimes when they give surveys, they will give several surveys at the same time. And can you publish each of those separately? The answer is probably yes, especially if they are very different, if the topics are very different. What we're concerned about is that related information stay together so that it can be interpreted in the context of all the information about the same topic. Yes?
We have at time problem with authors from China and Turkey. Once they submit a manuscript, it goes peer review, it's accepted. Then send an email, please change author 2, 3, 4 and add the new author. It's not possible. At times we have to reject that book. So it's again a problem.
Yes, the question is a good question, and the problem is a common one, and that is changing the number or the names or the order of authors after the paper has been submitted or after it's been accepted for publication. You have to have a very good reason to request those changes. And most journal editors would be very, very suspicious about adding names or taking names off of an authorship list under those circumstances. This is why it's important to identify who will be an author and the order of authorship before you write the paper, if not before you do the research. Another question?
cross-check. Cross-check. Yeah, I do have received that kind of comments on my paper. So, for the introduction and discussion part, we are mainly using visualizing method. We are referring some other channels. So, how to...
Okay, the comment is that he has submitted papers and cross-checked, has come back and said, well, there's a lot of duplication here. And the question is, what do you do? Well, there are lots of things. A couple of things. It is possible to, well, first of all, you might want to consider citing the information. You could put the information in quotes and give a reference. That's one way to solve it. If it's general information, you can rewrite it in your own words. And as long as you're not stealing anybody's idea, that's also okay to rewrite it in your own words. It's a very common problem for non-native English speakers. They call it patch writing. If you're doing an experimental study and you're not very comfortable with your English, it's sometimes easier to take somebody else's description of the method section and stick it into your own paper. Journal editors are somewhat more understanding of that because of the language difficulty, but you're better off revising it in your own words or simply citing it. Does that help? Okay. Anything else?
Is there any minimum limit for a guest author, for example, to be allowed to be included as author?
Oh, I'm sorry, is there a minimum?
Minimum effort within the research.
I don't know, a lot of the authors I know are really into minimal efforts. The question is, how much do you have to do to be considered an author? And it's probably more who you know and what your rank is in the hierarchy. I don't know that there's an answer for that. One would hope that it would be a lot, but my guess is that it's political. Yes?
People around here seem to think that data collection alone is enough to get you authorship, but some journals clearly state that that's not enough. You have to contribute intellectually to the design, into the writing, into the interpretation of the results.
Yes, although I would say that it's not quite that simple, that if you are simply collecting data, that's not enough to be listed as an author. It depends on the kind of data. If you are analyzing samples and are the person who knows how those samples were analyzed and how to interpret the results, you're probably an author in that case. You might be a psychiatrist who is interviewing people and making the diagnosis, and those people who diagnosed as being schizophrenic are then put into the study. You might want to reference the fact that the psychiatrist had that function because that affects the research. But in general, simply collecting data does not justify authorship. A statistician who runs a t-test probably doesn't justify authorship, but if they help you design the study or if the analysis is particularly complicated, they should be listed as authors. Good questions.
If you look at the ICMG criteria for authorship, many times all the authors do not fulfill all the 4 criteria. So that's why some of the journals have not started contributorship. Who did what? So that's just...
Yes, it's an excellent point. How many of you have heard of contributorship? And how about guarantorship? Okay. Authorship is what you all think it is, what the ICMG has determined. Contributorship is where you list the contribution of each of the authors. I think it's a good idea, depending on how it's done. It may not be useful to know who wrote the first draft and who wrote the second draft, but there are certain parts of the research that probably should be identified who did what. Guarantorship is where one or even 2 of the authors, typically the most senior, basically testify to the journal that the research happened the way it has been reported and that they are guaranteeing the legitimacy of that research with their own reputation. So some journals, most I think in the European market, will use guarantorship. don't see it much in the other journals. Good question. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Farid.
Okay, good afternoon again. Actually, I think my part was about research ethics in publication. It's a bit tough to talk about this because, in a sense, you have to go back and forth from the research to what is required by the journals, and then go back again to the basic research, go back to the journal. So I tried to sort of mention both in a sense and have a small background for you. Initially, I was supposed to be the first speaker, so I could maybe set the pace, and then Tom would follow. But because Tom might have to leave before the end of the session, we switched the places here. It's just some tile work from Shiraz, one of the old gardens there. So here, between practice and research, we have to make this differentiation. Okay, practice is something that usually the individual is benefiting. You want to treat a patient, a specific patient. You want to diagnose them, and the benefits are usually for that individual person. But the research, in a sense, you're trying to test an hypothesis, and you want to contribute to general knowledge. So I think it's very important that we differentiate between practice and research. For research, you usually need a formal protocol, and you have to have some set of objectives, and again, you have to be very specific about the ways you're going to reach that objective. The basic ethical principles that are usually involved, there are usually three that are mentioned. One is the respect for the person, then there's beneficence, and then there's justice. I'm taking this from the Belmont report, but there are a lot of other organizations that also have talked about this. Later, see the Declaration of Helsinki has talked about this. You see it in the Nuremberg Code. So all of these different reports and codes and organizations usually put their emphasis on these aspects. The respect for the person is very important. The individual that you're going to be treating, the person you're going to be treating, should be autonomous. They have to decide for themselves. They have to be protected. You have to watch out for harm. You have to maximum the possible benefits and minimize the possible harms. And justice is also very important. When you're doing research, you should not single out people. When you're doing research, you don't have to do it on a specific race or gender or something like that. So when you want to do research, you have to take the society in mind, and you have to watch out so you don't separate people, and that everyone will have a fair chance of being participating in that research. So I think these are very important things before you want to start even, for a project or for a protocol. And these have to somehow be seen in the publication anyways. And the way you do that, and the way you present that in that publication, we might also be able to discuss further. Many of these things that we were going to talk about, especially with respect to medical research, the ethical principles and medical research, is part of the Declaration of Helsinki. It started in 1964 by the World Medical Association. As you can see, there were lots of other meetings, and the last one was in October 2013. So they have, if you go to the site, you can see the whole Declaration of Helsinki, a lot of different clauses. I won't go through all of them because it's not very pertinent to this talk right now. I think you should all try to take a look if you haven't taken a look, and this really explains all the ethical aspects that are involved with research, a lot of them. I thought of special interest to us was this clause which says that author, editors, and publishers all have an ethical obligation with regard to publication of the results of research. Authors have a duty to make publicly available the results of their research on human subjects, and are accountable for the completeness and accuracy of the reports. They should adhere to accepted guidelines for ethical reporting. Negative and inconclusive, as well as positive results should be published or otherwise made publicly available. Sources of funding, institutional affiliations, and conflicts of interest should be declared in the publication. Reports of research not in accordance with the principles of this declaration should not be accepted for publication. So I thought this clause was very important because it pretty much depicts all the things that we might have been talking about up to now, and maybe further on when we will discuss some other aspects. There's talk about inconclusive results, some of the negative results that are never published, the side effects of some drug are never published, and this is maybe why they move towards the clinical trial registration and all the other parameters that have been discussed before, and maybe we can also mention again. So now again, if you want to talk about the institutional review boards, again it has two aspects. One that we mention in the journal and what it really is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it really is and then how it should be depicted in the journals when you finish your work and you want to report this. So we're going back and forth. Institutional review boards, it's maybe something a little bit newer maybe in our region, but now even institutions, pretty much a lot of the institutions, at least in the world and in our regions, even a hospital or institution, a university will have an institutional review board. Then we have the national board. Sometimes we have even provincial ones, like the province might have their own institutional review boards. A nation might have one. A country, like the Ministry of Health, might have an institutional review board. And even now international organizations, a lot of them have institutional review boards. So if WHO wants to do a trial somewhere in Africa, the protocol that someone is submitting will have to go to that ethical board in WHO, even if it's accepted by the country, even if it's accepted by the institution, it still has to go through that ethical clearance by the funding organization, which might in this case be WHO. So I think now in our region it's also developing a lot. Now I think many of the universities, I'm sure they have institutional review boards. Some hospitals might have it, the ministries have it, and which is a very good sign. I won't go into the details of what the institutional review boards they have to have, but they usually have people which are heterogeneous. They have to have different backgrounds. We even have lay people. Again, these are very important in our culture because all culture in the Middle East is a bit maybe different than other places, and also for other places. You have to have people, like if you want to do a trial,